"She is not worth my time," the Duke of Sablewick said, and did not trouble to lower his voice. He said it the way a man discards a card he has no use for, glancing once across Lady Marchmont's crowded drawing-room at the pale young woman in grey who stood half-hidden behind an old dowager's chair, and then turning away as though she had already ceased to exist. The candles blazed above him in their crystal tiers. The music had not yet begun. And in the small, ringing silence that follows any careless cruelty spoken too loudly, Evander Ashcombe, 9th Duke of Sablewick, felt nothing at all, not shame, not curiosity, not even the mild interest a man might spare for a moth against the glass. Beside him, young Lord Harcourt laughed the eager laugh of a man who wished to be thought clever by his betters. "I only meant, your grace, that she has a good eye. Draws, they say, Miss Wren, companion to the Pennington woman." "Then let her draw," Evander answered. "I did not come north to be introduced to the furniture." It ought to have ended there. It very nearly did. He had come to Thornbury Hall because Lady Marchmont had written him 3 letters, each warmer than the last, and because a man in his position could not decline every invitation in the county without inviting the sort of talk that did more damage than a bad harvest. He had come because Sablewick, his own great house 40 miles to the west, had grown too quiet since his brother died, and the quiet had a way of following him from room to room like a dog that would not be sent away. And he had come, if he was honest, which he seldom was, even with himself, because he was expected to choose a wife this season, and Lady Marchmont's house party had been assembled, transparently, to set the loveliest young women of 3 counties before him like plate before a hungry man. The loveliest of them all was Miss Cordelia Fay, and she was crossing the room toward him now. She moved as though she had been taught to move by someone who understood that a beautiful woman entering a room is a kind of weather, and that the wise thing is to make everyone feel it change. Her gown was the color of ripe apricots. Her hair had been dressed by a maid who must have risen at 4. She smiled at Evander with the frank confidence of a woman who has never once in her life been told she was not worth someone's time, and could not have imagined the words applied to her. "Your Grace," she said, and curtsied precisely as deep as his rank required and not a hair's breadth deeper. "Mamma despaired of you coming at all. She said the Duke of Sablewick has forgotten how to be amused." "Your mother is a shrewd woman." "She is a dreadful woman," Cordelia said, and the daring of it made Harcourt gasp and made Evander, almost against his will, look at her a second time. "But she is right about you. You look, if you will forgive me, like a man attending his own funeral and finding the arrangements not to his taste." He did not smile. He had nearly forgotten how, and did not intend to relearn the art for the amusement of Lady Marchmont's guests, but he inclined his head a fraction, which from him was a great concession, and Cordelia took it as the victory it was. Across the room, the woman in grey had bent to say something to the old dowager in the chair. Mrs. Pennington Evander placed the name now, a stout, half-deaf, wealthy widow who was carried from house to house each autumn like a piece of good silver too valuable to leave at home. The young companion tucked a shawl higher on the old woman's shoulders, and listened to whatever complaint was being made to her, and answered it with a patience that Evander noted and dismissed in the same instant. Servants were patient. It was what they were for. He did not see her face clearly. He did not try. If asked an hour later to describe Miss Wren, he could have said only that she was small, that she wore grey, and that she had the kind of stillness that made a room forget she was in it. This last he would have counted a fault. He counted a great many things faults in those days. The music began. The dancing began. Cordelia Fay danced twice with him, which set every mother in the room to calculating, and Evander endured it with the grim competence of a man performing a duty. Between the sets he stood at the tall windows and looked out at the dark park and thought about his orchards. That was the thing that gnawed at him under the boredom, under the cynicism he wore like a good coat, the orchards. Sablewick had been famous for 200 years for its apples. The whole village of Nethercot lived by them, by the pressing and the barreling and the carting of them to market. And for 2 seasons now a blight had crept through the old trees, curling the leaves, blackening the fruit, and no man he had hired could tell him why or how to stop it. His steward, Crow, spoke of felling the whole orchard and beginning again, which would take 20 years and ruin the village in the doing. The bankers in the city spoke of a mortgage his brother had taken and never told him of. And the tenants of Nethercott, when he rode through, looked at him with the particular blankness of people who have stopped expecting anything from the man who owns their lives. He was thinking of all this, and of nothing pleasant, when the disturbance began at the far door. It was the sort of ripple a crowd makes when something has gone wrong somewhere out of sight, a turning of heads, a lowering of voices, a footman moving too fast for good manners. Evander watched it cross the room. Then Lady Marchmont's own maid came hurrying to her mistress, white-faced, and Lady Marchmont's hand went to her throat, and the word passed from mouth to mouth until it reached even the windows where the Duke stood apart. The Pennington coachman's boy had been kicked by a horse in the stable yard. It was not, Evander understood at once, a matter for a drawing-room. Grooms were kicked, boys were kicked. It was the common coin of any great house, and the guests turned back to their partners with the relief of people excused from concern. Lady Marchmont dispatched a rider for the surgeon in the town 9 miles off, on a night that had begun to spit rain, and declared, to no one in particular, that everything possible was being done, and would the musicians be so good as to continue. But Evander, from the window, saw the woman in grey move. She did not hurry, which was the strange thing. She crossed to old Mrs. Pennington, spoke a few words, saw her settled with a card table of friends, and then she went out through the servant's door at the side of the room with a quickness that was not hurry but was somehow faster than hurry, the quickness of a person who already knows exactly what she means to do. She did not ask permission. She did not look to see whether anyone watched. And Evander, who had spent the evening being watched by everyone and warmed by none of it, found himself, for reasons he could not have named, setting down his glass and following her. He told himself afterward that he had gone out for the air. The stable yard was a scene from a darker world than the one he had left. Lanterns swung. A horse screamed somewhere in its stall. Men stood in a useless ring around a small shape on the cobbles, and the small shape was the coachman's boy, no more than 12, his leg bent wrongly beneath him and his face the gray-white of tallow, and his mother the Pennington laundress, someone said, kneeling over him and keening in a high, thin voice that was worse than any scream. Into this the woman in gray walked as though she had done it 100 times. "Stand back," she said, and they stood back. That was the first thing Evander marked, watching from the shadow of the arch where no one saw him, that men twice her size gave way when this small plain creature told them to, not because she raised her voice, she did not raise it, but because there was something in the flat certainty of it that a frightened person will always obey. "Bring the lantern close, not over his face, at his leg. You, to the laundress, hold his hand and speak to him. Tell him about his breakfast, tell him anything at all, keep his eyes on you and off his leg." She knelt in the wet and the filth in her one good gray gown, and put her hands on the boy. Evander had seen surgeons work. He had seen the regimental men after his brief, disillusioning season in the army, before his father's death called him home to a title he had never wanted. He knew the difference between a man who is guessing and a man who knows, and he saw at once, watching her fingers move along the boy's leg, that Miss Wren was not guessing. She found the break. She spoke to the boy the whole time in a low, even murmur. His name was Peter. She had learned it in a moment. And she told him what she was going to do before she did it. And she sent a groom running for 2 straight laths of wood and clean linen, and a bottle she named from her own room. And she set the leg with a single sure movement that made the boy cry out once and then, mercifully, faint. "Good," she said to the fainting. "That is the kindest thing his body could do for him just now. The splint quickly before he wakes." The surgeon, when he came an hour later, splashed and swearing at the rain, examined the boy where they had carried him to the warm kitchen, and looked for a long moment at the neat binding of the splint and the clean-dressed graze, and the careful way the leg had been raised on a folded blanket. "Who did this?" he demanded. "The lady," said the laundress, who had not left her son's side and whose eyes were red and worshipful. "Miss Wren." "Then Miss Wren has saved this boy his leg and very likely his life," the surgeon said, "for a bad set in a break like this festers, and I have buried children over less. You had a physician among the guests then?" "No," said the laundress, "only her." Evander stood in the doorway of the kitchen and said nothing, and was noticed by no one, and this too was strange to him, for he had never in his adult life stood in a doorway and gone unnoticed. He watched Miss Wren wash the blood from her hands in a basin by the fire. He watched her push a loosened strand of brown hair from her face with the back of her wrist, leaving a smear of soot on her cheek that no one told her of. He watched her say a quiet word to the laundress, and touch the sleeping boy's forehead once, and refuse. He heard her refuse. The cook's offered glass of wine, saying only that she would take a cup of tea to her room if it were no trouble, for she was tired, and Mrs. Pennington would want her early. Then she looked up, and across the steam and the firelight and the low, broad kitchen, she saw the Duke of Sablewick watching her. She did not start. She did not curtsy. She looked at him with two dark, level, extremely tired eyes, and Evander understood, with the abrupt cold clarity of a man who has walked into a wall in the dark, that she had heard him. "She is not worth my time." She had been standing not 10 feet from him when he said it, and she had heard every word, and she had said nothing then, and she said nothing now. She only looked at him, without anger and without appeal, as though she had long ago taken his measure and found it exactly what she had expected, and Evander, who could stare down a magistrate, a moneylender, a whole house of quarreling lords, found that he could not hold that tired, level, unfrightened gaze, and looked away first. He went back to the ball. He did not dance again. Cordelia Fay asked him what had become of him, and he said the air, and she pouted prettily, and he did not see it. Lady Marchmont's clock struck 1, and the guests began to drift to their rooms, and Evander lay in the great cold bed of the best guest chamber and did not sleep. He told himself it was the orchards. He told himself it was the mortgage, or the boy's white face, or the surgeon's words, or the rain that had settled into a steady drumming on the sill. He told himself a good many things, and believed none of them, and toward 4 o'clock, when the sky beyond the curtains had begun to go from black to the color of ash, he gave up the pretense and admitted the truth to the ceiling. He could not stop seeing her hands. The way they had moved along the boy's leg, sure and unhurried. The way she had knelt in her one gray gown without a thought for it. "She is not worth my time." He had said it of a woman who, an hour later, had done the single most competent and courageous thing he had witnessed in 5 years. Had done it for a stranger's child in the rain, expecting no reward and receiving none, and had then gone quietly to her narrow room to be tired alone. And he had said it of her in a crowded room, loudly, so that she should hear, because it had cost him nothing and had made a foolish young lord laugh. Evander Ashcombe was not a man much given to examining himself. He had found, since his brother's death, that the examination went badly, and he had learned to avoid it as one avoids a bad tooth. But there are hours before dawn in a strange house when a man cannot avoid anything, and in that hour he saw himself with a clarity he did not enjoy. A rich, cold, idle man, mourning a fortune and a brother and pitying himself in a warm bed, who had looked at the best person in the house and called her furniture. By 5:30 he was dressed. By 6, having asked a startled housemaid where the companion to Mrs. Pennington was lodged, and having been told, "The Dower Cottage, your Grace, at the edge of the park, the old one by the beeches," he had taken his greatcoat and his hat and let himself out of a side door into the gray wet morning, and was walking, with no plan and no proper reason and no notion on earth of what he meant to say, down the long avenue of dripping limes toward the small stone cottage at its end. The rain had stopped. The world smelled of wet leaves and wood smoke. A thin line of pale smoke rose from the cottage chimney. She was awake then, or someone was. Evander stood at the little gate with his hand on the cold latch and became aware, all at once, of how absurd a figure he cut a duke at dawn unannounced at a servant's door, and of the fact that he did not care. He lifted his hand and knocked. The door opened, and Miss Wren stood in it with a lamp in her hand and a shawl thrown over a plain wrapper, and looked at him with no more surprise than if dukes came knocking at dawn every day of her life. "His Grace of Sablewick," she said. "It was not a question." "You know me." "Everyone at Thornbury knows you, sir. You are the reason half the trunks in the county were unpacked this week." She did not move to let him in. She stood with the lamp between them, and the light came up under her face, and Evander saw her properly for the first time, not a plain woman at all, he thought, in the confusion of the moment, but a still one, which the world too often mistook for the same thing. She had a wide, grave mouth and dark brows and eyes that were brown and steady, and just now rimmed with the pink of a woman who had slept 2 hours. "Peter is well," she went on before he could speak. "If that is why you have come, the fever did not rise in the night. He will keep the leg." "I am glad of it." "Are you?" She said it flatly, not as insolence but as a fact she was testing against his face. "That is kind. You may tell Lady Marchmont, if she asks, that her stable boy will live. It will save her the trouble of sending to inquire, which I do not think she means to do." Evander had come 40 steps down a wet avenue with no idea what he meant to say, and now that he was here he found that all the easy things, the graceful things, the ducal things had deserted him. So he said the true thing instead, which he had not done in longer than he could remember. "I came to beg your pardon." Miss Wren's brows drew together the smallest degree. "For what, sir?" "You know very well for what." He made himself hold her eyes this time. "You were standing behind Mrs. Pennington's chair last night when I said a cruel and stupid thing within your hearing. I said you were not worth my time. I said it to make a fool laugh, and it did, and then I forgot you entirely, until I watched you set a child's leg in the rain and understood that I had, in one idle breath, given away the whole measure of myself and none of yours. I have not slept. I did not intend to come here. I find I could not stay away. That is the sum of it. I am sorry." For a long moment she said nothing at all. The smoke rose from the chimney. A blackbird tried a few wet notes in the beeches and thought better of it. "That," Miss Wren said at last, "is a good deal more apology than the offense has earned, and considerably more than I expected ever to receive for it. Men who say such things do not, as a rule, walk out at dawn to unsay them. Why did you?" "I have told you I could not sleep." "That is not a reason. That is a symptom." She tilted her head, studying him with the same clear attention she had turned on the boy's broken leg, and Evander had the disquieting sense of being read. "You are not troubled that you were unkind, your Grace. Men of your rank are unkind 100 times a day and sleep like the dead. You are troubled because you were unkind and then were proven wrong, and being wrong is a thing you are not used to, and it has kept you up all night like a stone in your boot. I do not say it to wound you. I say it because it is true, and you look like a man who is not often told true things." Evander opened his mouth to deny it, and found he could not. It landed in him with the peculiar force that truth has when it is spoken plainly by someone who wants nothing from you. He had been agreed with, flattered, obeyed, and feared for 15 years. He had not, in all that time, been simply and accurately described. "You are very direct," he said. "I have nothing to lose by it," she answered. "That is the one freedom of my position, sir, and I have learned to spend it. A woman who holds another woman's shawl for her bread cannot afford pride, but she may afford honesty, because no one is listening to her anyway." A ghost of something crossed her grave mouth, not quite a smile. "You will take cold standing in my garden. I cannot ask a duke into a companion's cottage at 6 in the morning without ruining us both, so I will bid you good day." "Your apology is accepted, your Grace. Go back to bed." And she shut the door. She shut the door on the Duke of Sablewick, gently and without insult, the way one closes a book one has finished, and Evander stood on the wet path and stared at the plain wood of it and felt, absurdly, that he had been dismissed, he, who had dismissed her not 12 hours before with a flick of his glance. The symmetry of it was not lost on him. He walked back up the avenue of limes with the cold coming through his boots, and he did not go back to bed. And by breakfast he had resolved, with the stubbornness that had carried him through worse and duller things, that he was not finished at Thornbury Hall. He stayed a fortnight. He had meant to stay 3 days. Cordelia Fay was delighted. Her mother, Lady Fay, was triumphant. Lady Marchmont wrote to 2 friends that the Duke of Sablewick was plainly on the point of an attachment, and that she, Lady Marchmont, had made the match. And Evander let them think it because it gave him cover to do the only thing he found he wished to do, which was to contrive, by every idle stratagem a clever man can devise, to be wherever Miss Wren was. It was not easily done. She was a companion, she was always occupied, she was always subtly in the wrong part of the house. But Mrs. Pennington was a great walker of gardens when the weather allowed, and where Mrs. Pennington walked, Miss Wren walked behind with the shawls and the smelling salts and the folding stool, and Evander discovered in himself an unexpected passion for the gardens of Thornbury Hall. "You are following me, sir," Miss Wren said on the 4th such morning, when Mrs. Pennington had settled on a bench in the sun to doze, and the 2 of them stood a little apart among the late roses. She said it without heat, arranging the older woman's shawl. "I am. You should not, it is remarked upon." "By whom?" "By everyone, your grace, which you know perfectly well." She straightened and faced him. "Miss Fay watches you as a cat watches a bird. Lady Fay has begun to watch me. A woman in my situation cannot be watched by a Lady Fay and come to any good. If you have an ounce of the kindness you rode out to my door to profess, you will pay court to the beautiful heiress they have gone to such trouble to set before you, and leave the paid companion to her shawls." "And if I find I would rather talk to the paid companion." "Then you are a foolish man as well as a proud one," she said, "and I had begun to hope you were only proud." He laughed. It surprised them both. It came out of him rusty and rough, like a door long unopened, and Mrs. Pennington stirred on her bench, and Miss Wren looked at him with a startled expression that softened, before she could govern it, into something almost like pleasure, and then hardened again, because she was a sensible woman and knew exactly how such things ended for women like her. But she talked to him. That was the thing. Against her own good judgment, in stolen quarters of an hour among the roses and the yew walks, and once, memorably, in the great cold library where she had been sent to fetch a book of sermons for Mrs. Pennington, and had stayed 20 minutes arguing with him about the sermons instead. She talked to him, and Evander, who had been bored for 5 years, discovered that he was not bored. Her name was Honora Wren. He got that from her by degrees, as one gets anything from a guarded person a fact at a time. Her father had been a country clergyman and a naturalist of small means and great enthusiasm, who had taught his only daughter Latin and botany, and the setting of bones because he had no son and could not bear to waste a good mind, and who had died 3 years since, leaving her nothing but his books, his knowledge, and a mountain of his debts. The living had gone to another man. The books had been sold to pay the debts, and Honora Wren, 24 and gently bred and educated far above her prospects, had done the only respectable thing left to a woman with no fortune and no family. She had hired herself out to hold an old woman's shawls. "You resent it," Evander said. "I did," she answered. "They were in the library. Rain streaked the tall windows. For the first year I resented it very much. I had been my father's fellow, sir, his amanuensis, his hands when his own grew unsteady. We named plants together. We set the whole parish's broken bones between us and delivered its children and drew its flowers by the 100. And then he died, and I went from being a clergyman's clever daughter who was somebody to being a piece of furniture that fetches and carries who is nobody. And yes, I resented it bitterly until I saw that the resentment was only making me smaller, and I could not afford to be any smaller than the world had already made me. So I stopped." She looked at the rain. "Mrs. Pennington is not unkind. She is deaf and old and lonely and frightened of dying, and I hold her hand in the night when the fear is on her, and there is worth in that, though no one sees it. I have made my peace, your grace. I keep my father's knowledge in my head where the creditors cannot sell it, and I use it where I can, and I do not expect the world to notice, because it does not. You noticed only because a horse kicked a boy at your feet. Had it not, I should have held shawls under your nose for a fortnight, and you would never have known my name. It was a rebuke, but a gentle one, and it went into Evander like a blade slid between the ribs, cold and clean, because it was true. He thought of the 100 house parties he had attended, the 100 quiet women in gray he had walked past without a glance, and he wondered, for the first time in his life, how many of them had been Honora Wren's, how many minds and hands and histories he had passed by as furniture, because they had not had the good fortune to kneel in his path in the rain. "Show me," he said abruptly. "Show you what, sir?" "Your drawings. Harcourt said you draw. I dismissed it as an accomplishment. You play, you sing, you draw, the whole tiresome catalogue. But your father was a naturalist and taught you to name plants. You do not draw ribbons and spaniels. Show me." She hesitated. It was the first time he had seen her genuinely uncertain, and it moved him more than her composure had. Then she went to the little bag she carried everywhere, that he had taken for a sewing bag, and drew out a portfolio of stiff paper tied with a ribbon, and laid it open on the library table. Evander had seen the botanical plates of famous men, the great folios that cost 100 guineas, kept under glass in the libraries of collectors. He had not expected to find their equal in a companion's workbag at a country house party. But there they were, page after page of plants drawn with a precision that was almost frightening, the veining of a leaf, the architecture of a seed head, a rose dissected into its parts and each part named in a small clear hand, in Latin and in English both. Fungi, grasses, the blight of wheat and the blight of the vine drawn in their stages, and here and here and here apple, apple leaf healthy, apple leaf curled, apple fruit sound, apple fruit blackened, and beneath each in that clear hand a note. Evander stood very still. "These last," he said, "the apples." "My father made a study of them," Honora said. "The orchard sickness. It came through our parish the year before he died. It has been creeping north for a decade, sir, though the great men who write the journals scarcely credit it yet. He believed it was not one sickness but two that ride together, a canker and a fly, and that felling the trees does nothing because the trouble is in the soil and the air, not the wood. He had a treatment. He tried it on the parson's own orchard the last spring of his life and thought it answered. He wrote it all down." Her mouth twisted. "The notebook was sold with the rest to a dealer in the city for 11 shillings, but I copied out the essential part before it went because it was ours, and here it is." She touched the drawing of the blackened apple. "Why do you go so pale, your grace?" Evander looked up from the ruined apple on the page to the grave, tired, clever face of the woman he had called furniture, and felt the whole shape of his fortnight, the whole shape, perhaps, of his life, turn quietly on its hinge. "Because," he said, "the orchards of Sablewick are dying of exactly this, and I have paid 4 men a great deal of money to tell me nothing, and you have been carrying the answer in a sewing bag through my acquaintance's rose garden for a week." She did not exclaim over the coincidence, as another woman might have done. She looked at him steadily, and then she looked back at the drawing, and Evander watched the naturalist's daughter come up behind her eyes like a second person stepping to a window. "Tell me the trees," she said. "How old? What sorts? Where they stand, do they take the morning sun, or does the ground hold wet? When did the curl come first, at the crown of the tree or the low boughs? Does the fruit blacken on the branch or after it is picked? I cannot promise you my father was right, your grace. But I can promise you he looked harder at this than any man you have paid because he loved it, and love is a better microscope than money." They talked for an hour. Mrs. Pennington's book of sermons lay forgotten. Evander told her everything he knew of Nethercott's orchards, which was, he was ashamed to find, very little, for he had left such things to Crow, and Honora asked questions he could not answer, and made a list of them in her clear hand, and told him what to have measured and cut and sent to her. Soil from 3 depths, a branch from a sick tree and a branch from a sound one, the black fruit and the curled leaf, all sealed in oiled paper against the damp. "And then," he said, and then I will look at them and tell you what I see, and it may be nothing." She tied up her portfolio. "You understand, sir, that I am a companion and a woman and the daughter of a poor parson, and that no one, not your steward, not your bankers, not the learned society you might apply to, will believe that the answer to a ducal estate's ruin came out of my head. They will not want to. It offends the order of things." "I do not care what offends the order of things." "You will," she said, with the weary certainty of one who had watched the order of things close over her father's grave. "When it costs you something, you will. Rich men are radicals until the bill arrives." But she said it without unkindness, and she took his list, and when Mrs. Pennington woke and called querulously for her shawl, Honora Wren rose and became a companion again in the space of a breath, and Evander was left in the library with the rain on the windows and the strong, strange sensation of having been, for 1 hour, less alone than he had been in years. The samples came within the week. Evander sent his own man riding to Sablewick with Honora's list, and the fellow returned 4 days later mud to the knees, with a saddlebag full of oiled paper packets, and a letter from Crow that was one long sniff of disapproval at being made to dig holes at the whim of a lady he had never met. Evander read the sniff and disregarded it. He carried the packets himself to the Dower cottage, openly, now in the afternoon, with Mrs. Pennington's maid for a chaperone, because he had decided he would rather be talked about than furtive, and he watched Honora Wren unwrap them at her small table with the concentrated joy of a woman handed back a language she had thought she would never speak again. She worked for 3 days. She had almost nothing to work with: a magnifying lens her father had left her, a few small bottles, the light of a north window, and she made it enough. On the 3rd evening she sent word by the maid that the Duke might call, and he came, and found her table covered in drawings and her face alight. "2 things," she said without preamble before he had fairly sat down. "Your steward is right and your steward is wrong, which is the most dangerous kind of man to have. He is right that there is a canker in the woods. See here, this black weeping at the fork of the branch. That is a true canker, and it must be cut out, hard, back to clean wood, and the wound sealed. But he is wrong that the trees must all come down, and he is wrong, I think criminally wrong, about the cause. Look." She pushed a saucer toward him. In it, curled in the last of the daylight, were 3 small pale grubs. "These were under the bark of the branch your man cut low, where the ground holds wet. There is your fly. It bores in, and where it bores the canker follows, because the wound lets it in. My father's whole discovery was this, your grace, and it is so simple that the learned men will despise it. The two travel together, but you cannot cure the tree by fighting the canker, because the canker is only the door the fly opens. Fight the fly. Clean the ground. Let the light and the air into the crown so the wet cannot sit. Cut the worst trees out to save the rest, not all, a third, the sickest, and treat the wounds with the wash he set down here, lime and sulfur and tar, which I have written out for you plainly. Do that, and I believe, I do not promise, I believe, that in 3 springs your orchards will bear again." Evander looked at the grubs, and at the drawings, and at her, and something happened in his chest that he had no name for. That was equal parts hope and shame, and a third thing he was not yet willing to look at directly. "Why," he said slowly, "did none of my 4 experts find these grubs?" "Because they did not cut the low wet branches," Honora said. "They cut the ones a tall man can reach standing up in a dry October in good boots. My father cut the branches a short woman could reach kneeling in the mud in March, because that is where the trouble hides. It is not cleverness, sir. It is only trouble. Your experts were paid whether they found the answer or not. I was not paid at all, so I had nothing to do but look." She began to gather her drawings. "You may keep these. I have copied what I need. Take them to Crow with my father's name on them, not mine, Reverend Josiah Wren, late of Cold Harbor Parish, and perhaps a dead clergyman will carry more weight with your steward than a living companion. It is a small deceit, but a useful one." "I will not do that." "You are being romantic, your grace, and it will cost your tenants their bread. Do the useful thing." "I will do the true thing," Evander said, "and I will make Crow answer to me, not to a name on a page." He stood, holding the drawings as though they were worth more than the mortgage, which in a sense they were. Miss Wren, Honora, I do not know how to thank you. I have men whose whole employment is to serve me, and they have served me worse in 5 years than you have in 3 days, for nothing, out of the memory of your father and, I hope, some small charity toward a man who insulted you across a ballroom. Do not make it charity, she said quietly, and for the first time she would not meet his eyes. It was not charity. I have missed this. That is the honest truth of it, sir, and you may as well have it, since you set such store by honest truths. I have missed being of use for something that is mine. I have held shawls for 3 years and told myself it was enough, and it was not, and you have handed me back 3 days of the only work I was ever made for, and I am grateful to you, which is a very great inconvenience, because I had determined not to be grateful to you for anything at all. The silence after that was not empty, it was full to the brim. Honora, he said, you should go, your grace. She kept her face to the drawings. It grows late, and the maid is yawning, and if you say another word in that voice, I shall forget every sensible thing I know, and I cannot afford to forget them. I have exactly one thing in this world, and it is my good sense, and I will thank you not to take that from me too. He went, but at the gate he turned, and she was standing in the lit doorway watching him go, one hand on the frame, and neither of them looked away for a long moment. And Evander walked back up the dark avenue understanding, with the finality of a key turning in a lock, that he had come north to choose a wife and had done it. God help him, on the first night, and had spent the fortnight since refusing to know it. He did not sleep again that night, but for a wholly different reason. The trouble was that a duke does not simply marry a penniless companion, however clever, however beloved, and expect the thing to be easy. Evander was not a coward, but he was not a fool either, and lying awake he counted the cost with the cold part of his mind that never quite slept. There was the mortgage, £20,000 his brother had signed away against the estate, falling due within the year, and no way to meet it but a rich marriage or the sale of half the land. Cordelia Fay came with £40,000. That was why she had been set before him. That was why every mother in 3 counties addressed her daughter and prayed. If he married Honora Wren, who came with a portfolio of drawings and a father's debts, he saved his tenants' orchards with one hand and lost their land with the other, unless the orchards could be made to pay in time, and orchards do not pay in a year. They pay in 3 springs, she had said. He did not have 3 springs. He had until Lady Day. He thought about it until the birds began, and in the gray of the morning he did a thing he was not proud of, though it seemed to him then the only prudent course. He decided to say nothing to Honora, to do the sensible, ducal, dynastic thing, to pay court to the heiress, save the estate, install a good orchard man to follow the Wren method, pension the tenants through the lean years, and keep in some locked room of himself the memory of 3 days and a woman who told him the truth. It was, he told himself, the responsible choice. It was what his father would have done. It was what a duke was for. He believed this for very nearly a whole day. He believed it, as has been said, for very nearly a whole day, and then his own feet betrayed him. It was the boy Peter who provided the pretext, though Evander would not have admitted, even to himself, that he wanted one. The child was mending well under Honora's care, but on the 9th night after the accident, a low fever crept up in him, the ordinary hazard of a bad break. She had warned the laundress, and word came up from the servants' quarters that Miss Wren was sitting with him, and that the surgeon had been sent for again, but might not come before morning through the rain. Evander heard of it as he was going up to his own room, and he stood a moment on the stair with his candle, and told himself that a duke had no business in a sick room among the servants, and that he had resolved that very morning to keep his distance and do the sensible thing. And then he turned, as though his body had settled the matter without consulting him, and went down the back stairs to the low, warm room off the kitchen where the boy lay. Honora was there alone but for the sleeping child. She sat on a hard chair drawn close to the cot, a single candle at her elbow, a book open and unregarded on her knee, one hand resting on the boy's forehead in the unconscious way of a woman who has sat by many bedsides. She did not start when the duke came in. She only looked up and took in his presence and the candle and the hour and said quietly, so as not to wake the child, "You should not be here, your grace." "So you are always telling me." He came and stood by the cot. The boy's face was flushed but peaceful, his breathing was even. "How is he?" "The fever is slight and falling already. He frightened his mother, but he will do. I sent her to sleep an hour ago. She has 3 others above stairs and cannot sit up all night with this one." She took her hand from the child's brow. "There is nothing here that needs a duke. You may go up with an easy mind." But he did not go. He looked about the low room, the scrubbed table, the banked fire, the shelf of the cook's crockery, the one guttering candle, and then he did a thing that surprised them both. He drew up the second hard chair, the plain kitchen chair on the far side of the cot, and sat down in it, filling it awkwardly, a large man in fine evening clothes in a servant's sick room, and said, "I will sit with you a while. You have been at this alone since dark. Even a sentry is relieved." She regarded him across the sleeping child with an expression he could not quite read, wariness, and something warmer moving beneath it. And then, to his lasting surprise, she did not send him away again. She only inclined her head a fraction, as one accepts a truce whose terms are not worth disputing, and turned back to the boy. And for a long while neither of them spoke, and the rain ran down the black window, and the fire settled, and the child breathed, and Evander discovered that he was more at peace in that mean little room than he had been in any drawing-room in England. They talked by and by in the low voices the sick-room permits. He asked her about her father, and this time she told him more of the parish at Cold Harbor, of the long walks after specimens, of the winter evenings when the two of them had sat up over the drawing table just so, one candle between them, naming what they had found. He asked her whether she was ever lonely now, and she was silent a moment and then said, "Every day. But it is a bearable loneliness. There is a kind of loneliness that is only the absence of company, and one grows used to it. It is the other kind that undoes people, the loneliness of being among company and unseen, that I have had a great deal of these 3 years, and it is far the worse of the two, and I would not wish it on my enemy." She looked at him then levelly over the child. "You have it, I think, your grace, the second kind. You are never alone and always lonely. I have watched it in you all this week. It is why you keep coming down to sit in servants' rooms with companions and stable boys, because down here, for some reason, you are seen, and up there you are only bowed to." It was so exactly true that he had no answer to it and did not try to make one. He only sat with it and let her see that it had landed, and after a moment she gave him the ghost of a smile, the first he had earned from her, and said more gently, "I do not say it to wound you. I say it because it is true, and because I think no one has ever said it to you, and a man ought to be told the shape of his own trouble at least once, so that he may know what he is fighting." "You are a very unsettling person, Miss Wren," he said. "So my father used to say. He meant it as praise." And she smiled again, fuller this time, and in the single candle's light, with the tenderness of the sick room softening her grave face, Evander looked at her and thought, with a plummeting certainty, that he had never in his life seen anything he wanted so much to keep. The boy stirred and murmured. Honora leaned to him at once, laid her hand again on his brow, spoke a few low words that smoothed the child back into sleep, and Evander, watching her hands move, those hands, always her hands, felt the last of his morning's resolutions come loose from their moorings and drift away down the dark river of the hour. He knew, sitting there, that he would not marry Cordelia Fay. He knew it as plainly as he knew the rain. He did not yet know what he would do instead, or how a duke drowning in a dead man's mortgage might make a companion his duchess and keep his tenants' land beneath them. But he knew that the sensible plan he had built so carefully in the small hours was already a ruin, and that he was glad of it, and that the gladness itself was a kind of terror, because a man who has never wanted anything he could not buy does not know how to bear wanting something he might not be able to have. When he reached across the cot, later, to steady her book as it slid from her knee toward the candle, nothing more, his fingers brushed hers, and both of them went still. For the space of 3 heartbeats neither moved, and the whole low warm room seemed to hold its breath with them. And then Honora drew her hand back, not sharply, but with a deliberate quietness that was somehow more moving than any flinching would have been, and said, looking at the child and not at him, in a voice not quite steady, "You should go up now, your grace. Truly. The fever is broken, there is nothing more to sit for, and she stopped and began again more carefully, and I find I do not trust the hour or the candle or my own good sense, and I have told you before that my good sense is the only thing I own. Go up, please." He went, but at the door he paused and looked back, and she was sitting exactly as he had first found her, one hand on the sleeping child, the single candle gilding the plain gray of her gown. And it seemed to him the most beautiful thing he had ever looked at, and he carried the picture of it up the dark stairs and into his sleepless bed, and it was still there behind his eyes at dawn, a woman in gray by a guttering candle, seen at last, and wanted past all sense. And he understood that whatever the cost, whatever the mortgage, whatever the county said, he was not going to be able to do the sensible thing after all. He was still telling himself he would find some cleverer, safer way, some means to have her without scandal, to save the land and win the woman both, to arrange it all as he arranged everything from above, without risk. When the rain shut the house up on itself for 3 long days, and the idle guests turned to their cruel parlor games, and the matter was taken brutally out of his careful hands. What undid the resolution was Cordelia Fay herself, and the manner of its undoing taught Evander more about his own heart than a year of solitude could have done. He carried out the first part of his plan with the grim thoroughness he brought to all his duties. He paid court to Cordelia. He rode with her, sat by her at dinner, turned her music, and endured the transparent satisfaction of Lady Fay, who watched the whole performance like a gambler watching a horse she has backed pull ahead. Cordelia was beautiful and quick and not stupid. She was, Evander thought, in another life, in a fairer arrangement of the world, a woman a man might have grown fond of. But she had been raised to be an ornament and to want ornaments, and every hour in her company reminded him that he was choosing a fortune and calling it a wife, and the taste of it grew more bitter the longer he held it in his mouth. The thing broke open on a wet afternoon in the long gallery. The house party had been driven indoors by 3 days of rain, and the guests were fractious with confinement, playing cards and quarreling gently and inventing amusements to pass the time. Someone proposed a game of characters, each lady to be described by a gentleman, the company to guess who was meant. It was the sort of cruel parlor game that flourishes among idle people, and Evander disliked it and might have withdrawn, but Cordelia caught his sleeve and would not let him, and so he stayed. It went on merrily enough, the descriptions flattering, the guessing easy, until Lord Harcourt, emboldened by wine and wishing again to be thought clever, offered his character. "She is gray as a mouse," he said, "and quiet as a mouse, and she carries another woman's shawls, and if you spoke to her at breakfast you would forget her by luncheon. In short, she is not worth anyone's time." And he looked, laughing, straight at the corner where Honora Wren sat with Mrs. Pennington's work-basket, and the whole company followed his look, and understood and laughed. They laughed. That was what Evander would remember. 24 well-bred people in silk, laughing at a woman who had set a child's leg in the rain and asked nothing for it, laughing because a foolish young man had thrown her his own careless words back at her like a stone, the very words the Duke of Sablewick had spoken on the first night, that Harcourt had heard and hoarded and now flung out for a laugh. "She is not worth anyone's time." And Honora sat very straight and very still under all their eyes, with her hands folded on the work-basket and her chin level, and did not flinch, and did not weep, and did not run, but bore it with the terrible dignity of a person who has been made small so many times that she has learned to bear it standing up. And Cordelia Fay at Evander's side laughed too, prettily, behind her fan. Something in the Duke of Sablewick, that had been thawing by slow degrees for a fortnight, cracked clean through in that instant, and what came out of it was not the cold thing he had lived behind for 5 years, but something older and hotter and cleaner, rage and shame, and above all a fierce, unbearable protectiveness that would not be governed. He stood up. The laughter faltered. When a duke stands, a room notices. "Lord Harcourt," Evander said, and his voice was quiet, which was far worse than loud. "You have described Miss Wren. Allow me to correct you, for you have got her entirely wrong, and I will not have a lady maligned in a house where I am a guest. Miss Wren is the daughter of a scholar and a naturalist, and is herself the equal of any man in this room in learning, and the superior of every man in this room in courage, which most of you have never had occasion to test, and she has. 9 nights ago, while we danced, a boy's leg was crushed in the stable yard. Not one of us moved. She went out into the rain and set the bone with her own hands and saved his life, and then she came back and asked for nothing, and went quietly to bed, and let all of us go on believing that nothing had happened worth our notice. She has, this very week, and again for nothing, given me the cure to a sickness that is killing the orchards that feed 600 souls on my land, a cure that 4 learned men I paid handsomely could not find, because she looked harder than they did, because she is clever than they are, and because, unlike every soul in this gallery, myself first among them, she has never in her life valued a person by the cut of their coat. You say she is not worth anyone's time." He let his gaze travel the whole laughing, silenced room and come to rest at last on Cordelia Fay, who had lowered her fan and gone white. "I said those words myself on the first night, and I have been ashamed of them every hour since. They were the words of a stupid man who had never troubled to look. I have looked now. And I tell you all, on my honor and my name, that Miss Honora Wren is worth more than every other soul beneath this roof combined, and that any one of you who laughs at her again laughs at me." The silence was total. Somewhere the rain ticked on the tall windows. Honora had risen during his speech. She stood by Mrs. Pennington's chair with a face he could not read, not gratitude, not the soft yielding a man might hope for, but something taut and pale and stricken, and when he had finished she did not thank him. She curtsied to the room, low and correct, and said, in a voice that carried perfectly to every listening ear, "You are all very kind to trouble yourselves about me. Pray do not. Mrs. Pennington is tired, I will take her up." And she gathered the old woman and the work-basket and the shawls, and went out, and left the Duke of Sablewick standing in the wreck of the afternoon he had just, with the best intentions in the world, blown to pieces. He found her an hour later in the small morning-room, alone, where she had come after settling Mrs. Pennington, and she rounded on him before he had shut the door. "How dare you," she said, and now there was heat in her, the first he had ever seen. "How dare you, sir? Do you know what you have done?" "I have defended you. I would do it again." "You have destroyed me." Her voice shook. "Do you understand nothing of the world I live in? An hour ago I was a gray nobody that no one thought of twice, and that, your grace, that invisibility was the whole of my safety. It was the wall I lived behind, and you have knocked it down in front of 24 people so that you might feel gallant. You have stood in a gallery and told every gossip in 3 counties that the Duke of Sablewick prizes his old friend's companion above an earl's daughter. Do you imagine any of them heard learning, or courage, or orchards? They heard scandal. They heard that a penniless nobody has got her hooks in a duke. By tomorrow it will be in 20 letters, and by next week Mrs. Pennington's sister will write to say she cannot keep in her employ a young woman whose name is spoken so. And Mrs. Pennington, who is kind but weak, will let me go with a good character and a month's wages, and I will be 24 and turned out with a reputation, and there is no country in the world, sir, no learning and no courage on earth, that will find another respectable place for a companion who has been talked of with a duke. You have not saved me. You have set fire to the one small dry room I had contrived to live in, and you did it to make yourself feel clean." Evander stood as though she had struck him, because in every particular she was right, and he had not seen it, because he had never had to see it, because a duke may knock down any wall he pleases and walk away over the rubble, and it is always someone else who lives in the cold. "Then marry me," he said. It came out of him raw, unplanned, the wrong way, at the wrong moment, and he knew it even as he said it and could not stop it, because it was the only true thing left in him. Honora went very still. "That is not a rescue, your grace," she said at last, low. "That is another wall coming down. Do not make me the answer to a mess you have made. I could not bear that. I would rather be turned out into the road tomorrow than be married out of a rich man's guilt and pitied for it every day of my life, and know that you took me because you had ruined me and were too proud to leave a thing you had broken lying in the road. I have very little, sir. I will not give up the last of it, my own knowledge that whoever takes me for myself, to save you the discomfort of having been unkind." She drew a breath. "You do not love me. You are ashamed and grateful and stirred, and those are not the same thing, though a man of your rank has perhaps never had cause to learn the difference. Go and marry your heiress and save your land. It is what you decided days ago. Oh yes, I saw it. I am not a fool. I watched you turn her music and I understood exactly what you had chosen and why. And I did not blame you for it because it was sensible, and I of all people know what it is to do the sensible thing. Go and do it, and leave me the dignity of refusing you, which is the only fine thing I shall have to keep." And for the second time, Honora Wren showed the Duke of Sablewick the door. He did not sleep that night either, and this time there was no comfort of resolution in the sleeplessness, only the slow, grinding recognition that he had, with a single generous, stupid, self-admiring act, done the very thing he had ridden to her door at dawn to atone for. He had used her to feel better about himself, and she would pay for it. He went over her words in the morning room until he knew them by heart. "That is not a rescue. That is another wall coming down. You do not love me. You are ashamed and grateful and stirred." She had been wrong about the last of it. He was certain now that he loved her. Certain in the particular way a man becomes certain of a thing at the exact moment he has lost the right to say so. But she had been savagely, precisely right about everything else, and the rightness of it kept him staring at the canopy of the great guest bed while the rain wore itself out against the glass. By breakfast the house already knew. He saw it in the way the talk stopped a half-beat when he entered the room, in the bright avid glances the ladies exchanged over their chocolate, in the studied blandness of the men. The story had grown overnight, as such stories do. By the version that reached him at the sideboard, the Duke of Sablewick had made a scene in the gallery, declared a passion for old Pennington's companion before the whole party, and been seen following her into the morning-room, from which she had emerged white and shaking a half-hour later. Every element of it was technically true, and the whole of it was a lie, and there was no possible way to correct it that would not make it worse. He understood now, at the sideboard with a plate he did not want, exactly what Honora had meant. The invisibility had been her wall. He had knocked it down for the pleasure of being seen to be gallant, and now she stood exposed in the open with no wall at all, and the wolves had scented blood. Lady Fay found him before the morning was out. She was too shrewd a general to reproach him. She came instead with the softest possible weapon, understanding, and it was more dangerous than any scolding. "Men are impulsive," she said, seating herself beside him in the window embrasure as though they were the oldest of confederates. "A pretty speech, a good cause, the wine perhaps a little forward at that hour. I do not blame you in the least, your grace. Chivalry does a man credit, but you will forgive a mother for observing that chivalry misapplied can do a young woman a great deal of harm. The Wren girl will suffer for this. There is no help for it now, the thing is said. The kindest course, the only kind course, is to let the talk die, which it will do within a week if you give it nothing further to feed upon. Turn your attention where it belongs. Cordelia has behaved beautifully. She has not spoken one word of reproach, though I know it wounded her. A public engagement would put the whole business to rest at a stroke. It would even, in a manner of speaking, protect the companion, for who would trouble to gossip about a duke's youthful gallantry once his betrothal to an earl's daughter was in the papers? You would be doing the Wren girl a service, your grace. You would be freeing her to slip back into her useful obscurity, which is, believe me, the only future that can do her any good at all. It was, Evander thought, a masterpiece of its kind. Every word of it was calculated to make the betrayal of Honora Wren appear an act of mercy toward her, and the pursuit of £40,000 appear a duty he owed the whole world. And the terrible thing, The thing that kept him silent in the window embrasure for a long, cold minute was that some part of it was true. The talk would die faster if he married Cordelia. Honora might indeed slip back into obscurity more easily behind a ducal engagement than behind a ducal scandal. Lady Fay was offering him a way to be prudent and call it kind, and he had spent his whole life mistaking prudence for kindness, and the habit was strong in him, and the mortgage fell due at Lady Day. "You are very persuasive, madam," he said at last. "I'm merely sensible, your grace, as I am sure, on reflection, you will be." And she pressed his arm and rose and left him with it, well satisfied, for she had learned long ago that the surest way to move a proud man is to make his surrender look like the higher road. He was still sitting in the window an hour later when he saw Honora cross the far end of the terrace below. She was walking behind Mrs. Pennington's bath chair, which a footman pushed along the gravel in the thin, apologetic sunshine that had followed the rain, and she carried, as she always carried, the shawls and the work-basket and the folding stool. From this distance she was again exactly what she had been on the first night, a small figure in gray, half attending an old woman, easily overlooked. But Evander watched her, and saw what he had not been able to see on the first night. The straightness of her back under the weight of a scandal she had not asked for, the composure with which she bent to answer some querulous complaint from the chair, the way she paused once to lift a fallen rose out of the path of the wheel, gently, so that it should not be crushed, a small unwitnessed kindness performed for a flower, because kindness was simply the shape her hands took when they had nothing else to do. No one on the terrace looked at her. They were all still, looking sidelong at the doors for the Duke. And she went on down the gravel in her gray gown, carrying her burdens, tending her old woman, keeping her dignity in the one way left to her. And Evander understood, watching her, that the coarse Lady Fay had dressed up as Mercy was not Mercy at all and never could be, and that a marriage bought with £40,000 and the quiet sacrifice of that small, straight-backed figure on the gravel would poison every year of the rest of his life. But he did not go down to her. That was the failure that would gnaw at him through the winter, that he would never quite forgive himself even when all was mended. He told himself she had forbidden it, go and marry your heiress and save your land, and that to approach her again would only feed the gossip and wound her the more. And there was truth in that, as there is always just enough truth in the reasons a man gives for doing the easy thing. But beneath the reasons lay the plain fact that he was afraid. Afraid of the mortgage, afraid of ruin, afraid of the county's laughter, afraid, at the very bottom of it, of being the first Duke of Sablewick in 300 years to marry beneath his name and be talked of for it forever. So he sat in the window and let her walk away down the gravel and did nothing. And he told himself there would be time later when the talk had cooled, to think what was right, not knowing, as he watched her small gray figure turn the corner of the balustrade and pass out of sight. How little time there was to be, and how dearly he would pay for the hours he let fall, one after another, into the well of his own hesitation. It happened as she had foretold, and faster. Within 3 days, a letter came from Mrs. Pennington's married sister in Bath. Evander learned of it later, in every particular, because he made it his business to learn. A letter full of loving concern and iron purpose, saying that dear Honora was a treasure, but that a young woman so unfortunately talked of could not remain in the family's employ without injury to them all, and that surely dear sister saw that. And Mrs. Pennington, who was old and deaf and frightened and loved Honora, and had not the strength to fight her own family for her, wept, and gave Honora a quarter's wages, and a character so glowing it was almost an apology, and let her go. By the time Evander rode down to the Dower cottage on the 4th morning, having spent 3 days in a private war with his own pride and lost it, the cottage was empty. The fire was cold. The little gate stood open. A carrier had come at dawn, the housemaid told him, twisting her apron, and taken Miss Wren and her one trunk and her work-bag to the coaching inn at Thornbury Cross. And Miss Wren had left no direction, only a word for his grace if he asked. That she was well, that he must not follow, and that he was to go home and save his orchards and think of her, if he thought of her at all, as a woman who had been glad once to be of use. He stood in the cold cottage and read the message off the frightened maid's memory, and felt the floor of his life tilt beneath him. He looked for her, of course he looked for her. He was a duke, he had money and men and horses. And he learned within a day that she had taken the northern mail, and within a week that she had gone to a cousin of her father's near the Scottish border, a poor half-pay lieutenant with a house full of daughters and no room to spare, and that from there she had answered an advertisement and taken a place, not as a companion now, for her name was smirched, but as an under-governess to the young family of a wool merchant near Kendal, £40 a year and her keep. Teaching Latin and drawing to children who would forget both. It was a come-down even from holding shawls. It was, Evander understood, exactly the fate she had described to him in the morning-room, and he had brought it on her with his own gallant, blundering, self-satisfied tongue. He wrote to her, she did not answer. He wrote again, more carefully, no longer the Duke pardoning a companion, but a man laying his whole poor case before the one person who had ever told him the truth, that he had not spoken in guilt, or not only, that he had known his own heart before the parlor game and had been too great a coward to own it, that he was ashamed of his caution and ashamed of his rank, and would give up a great deal of the second to be worthy of the first. She did not answer that either. But the letter came back unopened, which meant she had at least held it in her hand and chosen, and Evander took a bleak comfort from the choosing, because a woman who felt nothing would have let it lie in the pile. He went home to Sablewick. He had not meant to. He had meant in the first heat to ride to Kendal and lay siege to a wool merchant's schoolroom until she relented, but the memory of her voice stopped him. That is not a rescue, that is another wall coming down, and he understood that to descend on her in her new hiding place with his money, and his name would be only to knock down the next wall she had built and ruin her a second time. She had asked for one thing, that he not follow. If he loved her, and he did, he named it to himself at last, plainly, riding south through the November rain, I love her, and the words felt truer than any he had spoken in his life. Then the first proof of it must be to obey the one boundary she had set, and to become, in the meantime, a man she might one day be willing to be found by. So he went home, and he set his house in order, and it was the hardest and best winter's work he had ever done. He began with the orchards. He took Honora's father's method, the drawings, the wash of lime and sulphur and tar, the ruthless cutting out of the sickest third of the trees, the opening of the crowns, the draining of the wet low ground where the fly bred, and he did not hand it to Crow to bungle. He rode to Nethercot himself in the sleet, and he walked the frozen orchard rows with the oldest applemen of the village, the ones Crow had never thought to ask, and he found that they had known for years where the wet lay and where the trouble started, and had never been asked, because no one asks the man who prunes the low branches. He asked them now. He set them to work by the wren method and paid them a fair wage to do it, and when Crow protested that it was madness, that a lady's fancy was no basis for the ruin of a good orchard, Evander looked at his steward for a long moment and said only, the lady was right about the grubs, Crow, and you were wrong, and I find I no longer care to employ a man who would rather be comfortable than correct. And he pensionied Crow, without malice and without regret, and promoted the honest under-steward in his place, and slept the better for it. Then he turned to the mortgage, and here was the true test, and here he did the thing that no one who had known the old Duke of Sablewick would have believed. £20,000 fell due at Lady Day. There were two ways to meet it. One was Cordelia Fay's £40,000, which was his for the asking. Lady Fay had made it clear through a dozen channels that the parlor-room scandal was forgiven, that a duke's public folly over a companion was the sort of thing a sensible family overlooked in a great match, and that Cordelia's hand and fortune remained open to him. It would have solved everything in an afternoon. The estate would be safe, the tenants secure, the orchards free to heal at their own slow pace with money to spare. The other way was to sell. Sablewick held, beyond the great house and the home farm and the orchards of Nethercot, a second property 40 miles east Marsh End, a flat, fertile, unlovely tract of grazing land his grandfather had bought as an investment and no duke had set foot on in 30 years. It was worth, a good agent told him, something above £20,000. To sell it was to break up the estate his fathers had spent 300 years assembling. It was the thing every duke was raised to regard as a species of death. It was, Crow would have said, unthinkable. Evander thought about it for exactly one night. He thought about a woman kneeling in the mud in March, cutting the low, wet branches no one else would stoop to. He thought about £40 a year and a wool merchant's schoolroom. He thought about the difference between doing the sensible thing and doing the true thing, which she had tried to teach him, and which he had been too proud to learn until it cost him everything. And in the morning he sent for the agent and sold Marsh End, land his grandfather had never loved and no living soul at Sablewick had ever seen, and paid off his brother's mortgage to the last shilling, and kept his tenants and his orchards and his honor, and married no one. He was, by the turn of the year, a poorer duke than he had been, and a freer one, and the county thought him mad. Let them, he thought. He had spent 39 years being magnificent and admired and entirely alone. He would spend the rest, if he must, being talked of and solvent and true. But he found, as the winter wore on toward spring, that being true was not enough, that a man may set his whole house in order and still lie awake, because the one room he most wanted to fill stood empty, and no amount of virtuous estate management would fill it. He did not write to her again. He had promised himself he would not follow. But he did one thing in the deep of February that was not quite following, or told himself it was not. He wrote, not to Honora, but to the wool merchant of Kendal, a Mr. Hartop, a plain, blunt man of business, and he did not mention Honora's name at all. He wrote as one man of affairs to another, having heard. So his letter said that Mr. Hartop's household included a young gentlewoman of unusual botanical learning, the daughter of the late naturalist Reverend Josiah Wren, whose work on the orchard blight was of great and growing interest to the agricultural societies, and that he, the Duke of Sablewick, was assembling and printing, at his own expense, a full account of the Wren method, which had this season saved his orchards, and wished the work to appear under its rightful author's name, with all honor and such profit as might accrue. And would Mr. Hartop be so good as to convey to the young lady the enclosed, and assure her that no reply was required, and that the Duke of Sablewick asked nothing of her but her leave to give her father and herself their due. The enclosed was a bound proof of the pamphlet. On the title page, in clear black type, it read, "An account of the sickness of orchards and its cure, from the papers of the Reverend Josiah Wren, prepared and set forth by his daughter Miss Honora Wren." And beneath, smaller, published at the charge of the Duke of Sablewick, who owes his orchards and much besides to her learning. He sent it and heard nothing, and told himself he had expected nothing, and did not believe himself, and the winter dragged its cold length toward March. He would remember that winter in the years after, less for the sale of Marsh End than for a single week in January, before ever the agent came about the land, the week the fever came to Nethercot, and taught him with its own hard hand the thing that all his brooding had only circled. It began in the wheelwright's household and spread down the frozen lane from door to door, the way such sicknesses do in a hard winter when the poor are shut up close with their smoking fires, and within days half the village was abed, and the parish had no physician nearer than the town, 9 miles off over roads a foot deep in snow. In another year Evander would have heard of it a fortnight late, from Crow, as a line in an account of lost labor, and would have sent a guinea and thought no more of it. But there was no Crow now, and the honest fellow who had taken his place came straight to the great house with his hat in his hand and said plainly, "Your Grace, they are dying down there, and I do not know what to do, and I did not know who else to tell." So Evander went down to Nethercot himself, which no Duke of Sablewick had done in living memory except to ride through it, and there he found a thing that shamed and remade him. He found the wheelwright's youngest, a small fierce-eyed creature burning with fever on a pallet by a cold hearth because the family had no coal and no hands to nurse, every soul who might have nursed being sick themselves. He found an old woman dead in her chair 2 doors down, with no one yet strong enough to see to her. He found, in short, the ordinary catastrophe of the poor, which had always been going forward within a mile of his warm library, and which he had contrived, for 39 years, never once to see. And he thought of Honora. He thought of her with an ache that was near to physical, standing in the wheelwright's cold cottage while the small fevered child fought for breath, because she would have known what to do. She would have walked in and said, "Stand back," in that flat, certain voice, and got the fire lit and the child raised up and the throat eased with some steam of her father's devising, and gone from house to house through the snow doing the thing she was made for, and half of them would have lived who might otherwise have died. He had sent her away. Out of pride and fear he had sent away the one soul in all his world who could have met this hour, and now the hour was upon him, and he had only himself, who knew nothing. But he did what he could, which was more than he had ever done, and he did it with his own hands. He sent his fastest rider for the town physician and paid him triple to come through the snow. He had coal carried down from the great house by the cartload and a fire lit on every stricken hearth. He had the cook boil broth by the vat, and carried it himself, a duke in his shirt-sleeves with a steaming can from door to door down the frozen lane. And he sat up 2 nights running in the wheelwright's cottage with the small fierce child, because there was no one else to do it, doing the one thing he had learned by watching Honora on the very first night, keeping the child's eyes fixed on his own, talking low and steady about anything at all, about horses and apples and the great white owl that lived in the Sablewick barns, tethering the small frightened mind to the warm world while the body did its fighting. The physician, when he came, bled the worst and shook his head over others and did, in truth, not a great deal more than Evander had done. But the fires and the broth and the long nights of nursing carried the village through, and when the fever broke at last, Nethercot had buried 3 of its old and not one of its young, which the eldest folk agreed was a mercy past hoping, and which they laid, to Evander's lasting discomfort, at their duke's own door. "You saved my girl," the wheelwright said. "On the morning the child sat up and asked for bread, weeping and not ashamed of it. You, your grace, with your own hands, 2 nights together in my house. I'll not forget it. Nethercot'll not forget it." "I did very little," Evander said, and meant it. "There was a woman once who taught me the little I did how to keep a frightened child looking at your face and not at its own fear. I only borrowed what she taught me. If your girl lives, she owes it more to a companion in a gray gown, whom none of you ever met, than she owes to me." And he found he could say no more, and went out into the snow, and stood a while among the black skeleton rows of the mending orchard, and was more homesick for a woman he had known a fortnight than he had ever been for any place or person in his life. It was that week, more than any sermon or any solitude, that finished the work Honora had begun in him. Standing in the snow with the wheelwright's thanks ringing in his ears, thanks he had not earned, for a skill that was hers and not his, he understood at last, all the way down, the thing she had told him in a lamplit doorway at the very beginning, that there was worth in the world the ballroom never counted, and that he had spent his life among people who could not see it, and had been one of them, and need not be one of them any longer. He had thought in his pride that to be a good duke was to be magnificent. He saw now that it was to carry the broth, and sit up in the cold, and know the names of the children on his land, and that the woman who had taught him this, without ever meaning to, by the plain example of a life spent being useful where no one looked, was the only teacher he had ever had who had made him more than he was. He did not write to tell her of the fever. It seemed to him a kind of taking, to lay his new-won virtue at her feet like a dog with a bird, when he had earned it only by first driving her away. But he labored the harder, in the long evenings that followed, over her father's papers and her drawings. And when the pamphlet was printed and sent north with its single undemanding line, it carried, though she could not have read it there, the whole of that snowbound week folded invisibly inside it. Every can of broth and every cold hour of nursing pressed between the printed pages like a flower, an offering she would never see and he would never name from a man who had learned. Too late to spare her, but not too late to be changed by it. Exactly what she was worth. And so the winter wore itself down toward spring, and the snow drew back off the orchard rows, and Evander waited for the frost to break, for the buds to swell, for some sign in the mending trees or the wider world that the long, cold labor of the season had not been in vain, not daring, yet, to hope that the sign, when it came, might come in her own clear hand. The first answer came not from Honora but from the wider world, and it came in a way Evander had not foreseen. The pamphlet, which he had printed chiefly as an act of restitution, took hold. He had sent copies to the agricultural societies as a matter of form, but the orchard blight had been creeping north through the apple counties for a decade, ruining growers who had no dukes to carry their losses, and here at last was a clear account of it: the fly and the canker that rode together, the low wet branches, the wash, the cutting out set down so plainly that any orchardman could follow it, and signed with the authority of an estate that had used it and could show the results. Letters began to arrive at Sablewick, then requests for more copies, then a grave and courtly letter from the secretary of the Northern Agricultural Society, asking whether the author, Miss Wren, might be prevailed upon to prepare a fuller treatise, with her drawings, which the society would be honored to publish, and for which it would, of course, pay. Evander forwarded every letter to Kendall unopened by him, with a single line: "These are yours. I have not read them." He was learning, slowly and against his whole nature, the difference between lifting a person and standing between them and their own light. Spring came to Nethercott, and the orchards, which had been cut hard and washed and drained through the bitter months, did a thing that made the oldest apple man in the village take off his hat and stand bareheaded among the trees. They bloomed. Not all of them, and not richly 3 springs, she had said, and it was only the first, but the sound trees foamed white along the mended rows, and the cut trees put out clean new wood, and the black weeping cankers had dried and healed under the wash, and there was not a curled leaf nor a boring grub to be found in a morning's search. The village, which had stopped expecting anything of the man who owned their lives, came out in the blossom time and looked at their duke walking the rows in his shirt-sleeves with the apple men, and something shifted in the way they looked at him, and Evander felt it, and was more moved by it than by any honor the House of Lords had ever done him. He wrote to tell her. He could not help it, she had given him this, and it seemed a kind of theft to keep the joy of it to himself. He wrote a short letter, careful and undemanding, describing only the blossom, the healed cankers, the old man taking off his hat. He asked for nothing. He signed it only, "Your grateful servant, Sablewick." And he sent it and did not expect a reply, and had schooled himself so thoroughly to not expecting that when the reply came, 3 weeks later, in a hand he had never seen but knew at once must be hers, clear and small and sure, he had to sit down before he could open it. It was not long. "Your Grace," it read, "I have had your letters, all of them, though I would not answer, and I have had the pamphlet, and the Society's letters, which have changed my life more than I can set down here, and which I know very well I owe to you, however you may protest that I owe you nothing. I have left the schoolroom. The Society has given me work, real work, my father's work and my own, and a small independence, and a roof in Kendal that is mine and no one's charity, and for the first time in 3 years I wake in the morning glad. You did this. You will say I did it, but I could not have, from a wool merchant's schoolroom, with a smirched name and no friend in the world, and we both know it. So I will say the thing I could not say in the morning room because I was too proud and too frightened, and because I did not then believe it. Thank you, and I am glad the orchards bloomed. I have thought of them and of you more than is good for my peace. That is all I can honestly write. I do not know what more there is to say, or whether there is any more to say at all. H. Wren. Evander read it 4 times. I do not know whether there is any more to say at all. It was not a door opened, but it was not a door shut either. It was a door left on the latch by a woman too honest to pretend she felt nothing and too wary to pretend she felt enough, and he understood that the next move was not hers to make. She had built her walls out of hard necessity, and every time he had knocked one down he had cost her dear. He would not knock this one down. If he went to her now it must be not as a duke bestowing himself, not as a rescuer, not as a man knocking down a wall, but as a suitor standing outside it, hat in hand, asking to be let through the gate, and prepared, if she said no, to turn and go and love her at a distance for the rest of his life. He waited a decent interval which nearly killed him. And then he did a thing he had refused to do all winter. He ordered his horse, and told no one his direction, and rode north to Kendal, not to descend on her, not to lay siege, but simply to be near and to send up his name, and to leave the choice, wholly and finally, in her hands. But before he could go, the last of it came for him at home, and it was the vindication he had never asked for and would not, in the end, need, but which the world, being the world, insisted on providing. Lady Fay came to Sablewick. She came uninvited, in a great deal of purple, with Cordelia beside her looking mutinous, on the pretext of a call, and with the plain object of at last securing the match that the whole autumn had failed to close. And she made, in Evander's own drawing-room, a serious tactical error. Believing him still the cold, proud, biddable duke of the ballroom, she attempted to remind him of what he owed his name. "You have had your little rebellion, your grace," she said, arranging herself on his best sofa. "Selling off Marsh End, half the county thinks you mad, and I confess I thought so myself. But it is not too late to be sensible. Cordelia has been patience itself. Society has forgotten your foolishness over that companion, the wren creature, was it? Quite forgotten it, and if you were to announce an engagement before the summer, why, the whole unfortunate episode would be as though it had never been. She was a nobody, after all, a grasping little nobody who overreached and was, I am glad to say, put in her place. One cannot blame a girl of that sort for trying, but one is glad when the natural order reasserts itself." Evander set down his cup. "Lady Fay," he said, in the quiet voice the parlor game had learned to fear, "I am going to say this once and plainly, and then I am going to ring for your carriage. Miss Honora Wren is a scholar whose name will be known and honored when yours and mine are dust. She saved my orchards and 600 livelihoods with her learning, and she saved a child's life with her hands, and she refused my hand, refused it, madam, twice, because she would not be married out of guilt, which is a delicacy of honor I do not think you would recognize if it bit you. You call her a grasping nobody. She is the least grasping soul I have ever known. She is the only person in my whole acquaintance who ever wanted nothing from me at all, which is precisely why I mean, if she will have me, to spend the rest of my life trying to deserve her. As for the natural order, madam, is that the best should be prized above the merely well-born, and I spent 39 years mistaking the second for the first, and I am done with it. Cordelia." He turned to the daughter, and his voice gentled, for the girl's sullen face had, under her mother's tirade, gone quietly ashamed. "You deserve a man who wants you, and I am not he, and I never was, and you have known it as long as I have. Find him. Do not let her sell you to the next great house on the list. That is not advice a duke owes an heiress. It is the only kind thing I have to give you, and I mean it." And he rang for the carriage. Cordelia paused at the door, while her mother swept ahead in a fury of purple, and looked back at him with an expression he had not seen on her before, clear-eyed, and a little rueful, and almost, at the last, a friend's. "She was worth your time, then," Cordelia said quietly, "the gray mouse, all along." "She was worth it," Evander said, "before I had the wit to see it. That was always the trouble with me, Miss Fay. I saw the price of everything and the worth of nothing. She taught me the difference. I hope you find someone who never needs to be taught." Cordelia almost smiled. "Go and get her," she said, "before some cleverer man than you does it first," and she went out, and Evander stood alone in his drawing-room with his heart hammering like a boy's, and did not wait a decent interval any longer, and did not wait at all. He ordered his horse for dawn. He did not sleep the night before he rode, and for once he did not wish to. He went out instead, near midnight, into the orchards of Nethercot, because he had found in the last weeks that the orchards were the one place his restlessness could bear itself. The moon was up, and the blossom hung along the mended rows in the pale light like drifts of late snow that gave off, instead of cold, a warm and living sweetness that filled the whole valley. Here and there among the trees the props stood where the applemen had braced the heaviest laden boughs, and the black cankers were healed to gray scars under their wash of lime, and the low wet ground was drained and dry, and there was not, though he searched a bough or two out of old anxious habit, one curled leaf or boring grub to be found. 3 springs, she had said. This was the first, and already the trees had answered her as everything answered her, it seemed, that was given honest care. He stood a long while under the blossom and thought about what he meant to do, and whether it was right. For it might not be right. That was the fear that had kept him from his bed. She had built a life for herself in Kendal out of nothing but her own courage, a name on a door, work the society paid for, a roof that was hers and no man's charity, and by her own written word, a gladness in her waking that she had not known in years. What right had he to ride 400 miles and set his shadow across it? Every time in his life that he had reached for her he had done her harm, a careless word across a ballroom, a gallant speech in a gallery, a proposal flung down like a coin to pay for a mess he had made. 3 times he had knocked down a wall she had built for her own shelter, and 3 times she had paid the cost of it, and he had learned nothing but slowly. What was to say that this 4th reaching would not be the worst of all, the rich man arriving in his glory to carry off the woman who had at last, in his despite, made herself free? He turned it over under the moon, honestly, the way she had taught him to turn things over without the flattering fog he had once wrapped every choice in, and at last he saw the difference and it steadied him. He was not going to Kendal to rescue her, for there was nothing left to rescue her from. He was not going to knock down a wall, for she stood now behind no wall but the plain closed door of her own house, which she might open or keep shut as she pleased. He was going only to stand outside that door and ask, to lay the whole of the choosing in her hands, as no one in her life had ever done, and to abide by her answer, whatever it cost him. That was not the reaching of the old proud duke who had called her furniture. That was something he had had to become, over a hard winter, in a snowbound cottage and a mending orchard and the long discipline of not following. And if she sent him away, he would have the cold comfort of knowing he had at last learned to love her in the only way that did her no harm, which was to want her happiness above his own, and to leave her free even of himself. He was turning back toward the house when a small figure came running between the trees. It was the wheelwright's youngest, the fierce-eyed one he had sat up with in January, mended now and brown and forbidden 100 times to be out after dark, escaped from a cottage window for the pure joy of the blossom and the moon. The little creature stopped short at the sight of the Duke, torn between flight and delight, and then, deciding delight, held up in 2 cupped hands a fallen bough-tip crowded with white flowers and offering, and said, breathless, "For you, your grace, the best one. Dust says you saved the orchard and me. Dust says you're not like the old lord at all." Evander took the blossom gravely as though it were a thing of great price, which in a way it was. "Your father is mistaken," he said. "I did not save the orchard. A lady told me how long ago, and I only did as she said. And I did not save you either. The same lady taught me the little I did that night. I am on my way tomorrow to find her and to ask whether she will come and live here and see the orchard she mended and be your mistress. What do you think? Shall I bring her home?" The small face considered this with tremendous seriousness. "Is she kind?" "She is the kindest person I have ever known," Evander said, "and the cleverest, and I was a fool not to know it sooner. That is the whole story of me, in short. Now go home before your mother wakes and finds you gone and lays it at my door with everything else." The child laughed and fled between the moonlit rows, and Evander stood a moment longer with the branch of blossom in his hand, and found that the last of his doubt had gone with the running feet. He would ride at dawn. He would ask and leave the choosing to her and abide by it. And whatever her answer, he would come home to these trees and these people and this life she had, all unknowing, given him, The life of a man who carried the broth and knew the children's names and did the true thing for its own sake. And he would live it with her or without her, because it was hers by right whether she ever consented to share it or not. He carried the blossom back to the great house and set it, absurdly, in a glass of water on his own bedside table, where it should be the last thing he saw before he slept and the first when he woke. And he lay down at last, and did sleep, an hour or two, dreamlessly. And before the sky had fairly grayed he was up and booted and in the saddle, turning the horse's head north, toward Kendall and the plain door, and the whole unknown of what she would say. He rode 2 days north with a spare horse, and slept badly at a coaching inn on the border of the fells, and came down into Kendall on the 3rd morning in the grey hour, before the town was properly awake, with the mist lying in the river valley and the smoke of the first fires going up straight into a windless sky. He had the direction from the Society's letters, a small house in a decent street near the church, taken by Miss H. Wren, botanical artist. He found it by asking a boy sweeping a step. And he sat his horse in the empty street and looked at the plain door of it, and understood, with a jolt that was almost laughter, that he had come to exactly the same place he had come at the very beginning, to a woman's door at dawn, unannounced, with no plan and no proper reason and no notion on earth of what he meant to say. Only everything else had changed. He dismounted. He tied the horse. He stood at the little gate with his hand on the cold latch, a duke poorer by an estate and richer by a soul, and he thought of the first dawn, of the dripping limes and the smell of wood smoke, of the door that had opened on a woman with a lamp who had accepted his apology and shut the door in his face and taught him, in that shutting, the first true thing he had learned in years. He had knocked that morning to unsay 4 careless words. He had come 400 miles in half a year to say 4 different ones, and he found that his hand was not quite steady. He knocked. Nothing for a long moment. Then a footstep within and the door opened, and Honora Wren stood in it. She was not in gray. That was the first thing he saw, and it undid him more than he could have said. She wore a plain gown of a soft dark green, the color of the leaves she drew, and her brown hair was loose about her face in the early way of a woman not yet dressed for the day, and there was ink on the side of her right hand, and behind her on a table he could see the litter of her work, papers and a lens and a jar with a cutting in it, and the gray light of a north window falling across all of it. She had a home. She had her work. She had plainly and at last herself. And she stood in her own doorway and looked at the Duke of Sablewick standing in her street at dawn, and her face went through surprise, and something that was almost fear, and something that was not fear at all, and settled at last into the grave stillness he had first mistaken for plainness, and now knew for the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "Your Grace," she said. Her voice was not quite level. "Honora, you promised you would not follow." "I promised I would not follow you into your hiding place and knock down your wall," he said. "You are not hiding any longer. You have a name on your own door and work the society pays for and a roof that is yours, and you told me yourself that you wake in the morning glad. I have not come to rescue you, Honora. There is nothing left to rescue you from. You have done it all yourself, and I have only stood back, for the first time in my life, and let a person be. I have come for one thing only, and if you send me away I will go, and I will not come again, and I will love you at a distance until I die, which I have found I can do, because I have been practicing it all winter." He took off his hat, because it seemed the thing to do, and stood bareheaded in the gray street like the old apple man among the trees. "I have come to court you, properly, from the beginning. As a suitor stands outside the gate and asks to be let in, not as a duke who assumes the door will open. I know I do not deserve it. I know I called you furniture across a ballroom and set fire to your safe small life to feel gallant, and I know the first proof of love a man like me can offer is to stand here and leave the whole of the choosing to you. So I am leaving it to you. May I come in, Honora, or shall I go?" She did not answer at once. She stood with one hand on the doorframe, the same gesture, he remembered, with which she had watched him walk away up the dark avenue half a year before, and her dark level eyes searched his face the way they had searched a broken leg and a blighted branch, looking for the truth of the thing, and Evander held still under that look and let her find whatever there was to find, and did not try to help her to it. "You sold Marsh End," she said at last. It was not what he had expected. The society men spoke of it. They could not understand it. A duke does not break up his estate. They said you must have been mad or in some scrape you would not own. But I understood it the moment I heard it, and I have not been able to stop thinking of it since. Her voice was very low. "You had £40,000 within your reach, and your whole world telling you to take it, and every duke who ever lived would have taken it. And you sold your grandfather's land instead and made yourself poorer and married no one and saved your tenants and your honor both, and you never wrote to tell me. You let me hear it from strangers. Why did you not write to tell me, sir? It was the one thing you did all winter that might have moved me, and you were too proud." "Too afraid," Evander said, "that you would think I did it for you, that I sold Marsh End to buy your good opinion or to clear my way to your door. And I did not. I sold it because it was the true thing to do, and you had taught me the difference between the true thing and the sensible thing, and I wanted, for once in my life, to do a right thing for its own sake and not for what it would win me, not even you. Especially not you. If I could not learn to be a good man without a woman as the price of it, then I was no fit man for any woman at all, least of all for you." He drew a breath. "So I did it quietly and told no one and asked nothing. And then the orchards bloomed, and I found I could not bear that you should not know, and I wrote you about the blossom because I could not help it, and you wrote back and left the door on the latch, and here I am. That is the whole truth of it, Honora. There is not one word of it arranged to please you. I have stopped arranging things to please people. It is the best thing you ever taught me." And Honora Wren, who had refused this man twice, and shut her door on him twice, and armored herself against him all winter with the last of her hard-won good sense, put her ink-stained hand over her mouth, and Evander saw with astonishment that the composure he had thought unbreakable was breaking at last, that her dark eyes had filled and spilled, and that she was weeping, not the weeping of grief, but the terrible undoing of a person who has held herself very tightly for a very long time, and is at last, in the gray light of her own doorway, letting go. "You wretched, wretched man," she said through it, half laughing and half crying. "Do you know what you have done? I had made myself so safe. I had my work and my roof and my little independence, and I had decided, sir, quite firmly, that I would be content with them, and that a woman who has learned to want nothing cannot be hurt, and that I would think of you kindly, from a great distance, as a person who had once done me an unlooked-for good turn, and be at peace. And you have ridden 400 miles and stood in my street at 6 in the morning with your hat off and undone the whole of it, because you did the one thing I had no defense against. You left me the choice. Everyone in my life has always decided for me, my father, out of love, Mrs. Pennington's sister, out of respectability, you yourself in the gallery, out of gallantry. No one ever stood at my gate and simply asked. And I find," her voice broke and steadied, "I find I cannot armor myself against a man who asks." "Then you have not sent me away." "No," she said. "God help us both, no." She wiped her eyes with the back of her ink-stained hand, leaving a faint gray smear at her temple, exactly as she had once left a smear of soot on her cheek in the Thornbury kitchen with no one to tell her of it, and Evander thought that he would spend the rest of his life telling her of such things, wiping such smears away and counting it the whole of his happiness. "But I will not have you on the old terms, sir. Do you understand me? I will not be a duchess who holds shawls in a grander house. I have my work. The society has commissioned a treatise. There will be more. I mean to finish my father's studies and put my own name to them and be a scholar as well as a wife, and if that is not what a Duchess of Sablewick may be, then you had better ride home now, because I have been small for other people's comfort for 3 years, and I will never be small again, not even for you, not even for love." "Honora," he was almost laughing out of pure joy. "I did not fall in love with a woman who holds shawls. I fell in love with a woman who set a boy's leg in the rain and found the grubs my experts missed and told me the truth to my face when no one in the world dared. Do you imagine I want to make her smaller? I have a library at Sablewick 40 feet long and empty of anything worth reading. I have a north room with the best light in the county, standing bare. I have a name that will get your treatises read where a poor scholar's would be ignored, and I would spend that name to the last penny of its credit to see your work honored. I have already begun to, and I mean to go on. be a scholar, be the greatest botanist in the kingdom. Only be it at Sablewick and be it as my wife, and let me carry the shawls for once and hold the lens, and be the one who fetches and is glad to be of use. I have had 39 years of being magnificent and alone. Let me try something else. She looked at him a long moment more, and then Honora Wren did the thing she had never once done in all their acquaintance. She smiled fully, unguardedly, the grave stillness breaking open into a warmth that transformed her whole face, and she stepped back from the door and held it wide and said, in a voice that shook only a little, "Then you had better come in out of the cold, your grace. You are letting the morning into my house, and I have a treatise to finish, and I find I should like you to see the light in my north room, and tell me whether it will do for the drawing of leaves." He went in, and the plain door of the small house in Kendal shut behind them gently on a duke and a scholar's daughter, and it was the same door that had once shut in his face and taught him everything. Only now he was on the inside of it, in the gray light and the smell of ink and cut greenery, and he was, for the first time in his life, exactly where he wished to be. They were married in the summer quietly at Nethercot, in the little church at the foot of the healed orchards, with the applemen and the laundress and the boy Peter walking now, without so much as a limp, in the pews among the county folk who had once laughed in Lady Marchmont's gallery. Some of those folk came. Curiosity brought them, and the sight of a duke marrying a scholar for love confounded them, as it was meant to. Old Mrs. Pennington came too, half-deaf and weeping happily, forgiven long since, for Honora had never had it in her to hold a grudge against a frightened old woman who had loved her as well as she was able. And Lord Harcourt did not come, and was not missed. The orchards of Sablewick bore fruit that autumn, and more the next, and by the third spring, exactly as she had said, they foamed white from end to end and cropped so heavily that the presses of Nethercot ran day and night, and the village prospered as it had not in living memory. The treatise, when it was published, under the name of Honora, Duchess of Sablewick, and dedicated to the memory of the Reverend Josiah Wren, was read across 3 kingdoms and saved 100 orchards its author never saw. The north room with the best light in the county was never bare again, and the long library filled, slowly, book by book, with things worth reading, because there was now someone in the house who read them. Evander Ashcombe grew old at Sablewick with his wife, and never once in all the years tired of watching her hands over a drawing, over a broken bird, over the fair heads of the children who ran the orchard rows in blossom time and learned their Latin and their leaf names at her knee. He had said on the worst night of his folly that she was not worth his time. He had come to understand that she was worth the whole of it, every hour and every year of it, and that he had very nearly, out of pride and habit and the cowardice that wears the mask of prudence, thrown that whole worth away for the price of a fortune he did not even need. He told her so once near the end of a long and happy life, sitting with her in the north room in the low gold light of a summer evening, her ink-stained hand in his. "I have been thinking of the first night," he said, "of what I said of you across that ballroom. She is not worth my time. I have never forgiven myself for it, you know, not truly. It is the one thing I would give a great deal to unsay." Honora, whose hair was silver now, and whose eyes were as grave and as clear as they had been in a lamplit doorway 40 years before, turned her hand in his and pressed it. "Do not unsay it, my love," she said. "I would not have it unsaid. If you had not spoken those 4 foolish words, you would never have lain awake ashamed and never walked out at dawn to my door, and I would have held shawls until I was old and died a gray nobody that no one thought of twice. And instead I have had all this, and you, and the whole wide use of the mind God gave me, and it began, all of it, with a proud man being cruel and then being brave enough to be sorry. Keep the words. They are the door I came through. I have thought sometimes that the best of my life came in by the worst of yours, and that is a strange grace, but it is a grace, and I will not have it unsaid." Outside the window the orchards ran white and green to the edge of the evening, and the light lay gold across 40 years of her drawings on the walls, and the Duke of Sablewick lifted his wife's hand to his lips, the same hand he had watched set a child's leg in the rain on the night that changed his life, and he thought that of all the things he had ever owned, the land and the name and the great cold magnificent house. This one small ink-stained hand was the only thing he had ever truly been worthy of. Because he had had to become worthy of it, and that the becoming had been the whole point, and the whole reward and the making of him. "Then I will keep them," he said, "but I will spend the rest of my days answering them. You were worth my time, Honora. You were worth every minute of it from the first, and I was only a fool too long in the learning. I have been trying to make up the arrears ever since, and I find, my love, that I never wish to have them paid, for it is the sweetest debt a man was ever glad to owe." And she smiled her grave, unguarded smile, and the gold light held them, and neither of them said anything more for a long while, because between two people who have at last learned the worth of one another, there is a kind of silence that says everything, and they had earned the whole of it and were content.